An EU-wide cap on the price of refined Russian oil exports has begun. It follows a meeting on Friday where EU members agreed to limit prices to cut the flow of revenue to Moscow. The cost of top-end products like diesel and gasoline is being held at $100 a barrel. For cheaper goods like fuel oil, it's $45. It's the latest round of sanctions to be imposed on Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Joining me now for more analysis on this is Christof Ruehl, who's a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Centre on Global Energy Policy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Can I first of all start by asking you about what the IEA Director General has been saying, that these price caps on Russian energy likely to hit the country's revenues by almost 30%. What's your assessment?
Good evening. That is an impossible to answer question because it depends what you compare it with. If we compare it to the situation before the war, so in 2009, before Corona, I should say, actually, we had in oil market several upheavals, then it will certainly depress revenues. If we compare it to the current situation, it might be a little less. But one thing is true, this is step 2 in a total embargo. The first step 2 months ago was embargo for crude oil, now it's embargo of refined products. If it goes anywhere similar to the first step, then it will help to keep prices low while keeping the oil available for consuming nations, including those in the European Union.
And what will the very significant market share loss mean for Russia in the long term, do you think?
So what this means is a giant reorientation of trade, just like in the case of crude oil 2 months ago. The European Union embargoes products. That doesn't mean it doesn't use any products anymore. Russian products will have to be sold elsewhere, for example, in Asia. And the EU imports have to be provided by somebody else, for example, the US, for example, the Middle East. So it's a giant reorganization. That is costly. Markets have shown themselves surprisingly resilient against that. So my guess is that we will see an increase in the margins for refined products. Means diesel, gasoline, kerosene, the things we need to fly and drive, become slightly more expensive. But nothing which cannot be rectified within a few months of market adjustments. And there's a second impact here which should not be underestimated, even though it's rarely discussed. During that reorientation, the storage capacity, in particular in Russia itself, for diesel and petrol and these refined products is very low. So while they were trying to get them out as quickly as possible, there will be also pressure on crude oil prices because they will try to sell crude oil prices to refineries abroad. And at the moment, there's enough crude oil everywhere. So all the signs in the short term are that this can be swallowed by the market without major disruptions, will result in a decline of Russian revenues, and will not hurt Western economies so much that it threatens a recession. In
Europe
the long
has,
term,
of course,
it's a different game.
Of course, sorry to interrupt you there. Europe has, of course, been working very hard to cut its dependence on Russian energy. You mentioned they are still, of course, using Russian products. But how is that effort going to wean itself off?
It's going surprisingly well. And the surprise is twofold. That's a completely random surprise, which is supported very much, of course, by the warm winter in Europe, which allowed Europe to live with much less natural gas imports than normal. But the other kind of the surprise is one which is by design. It is supported by a surprising degree of coherence and working together and, dare I say, solidarity among the European countries, which have, I think, surprised everyone geopolitically so far with the last year of executing these embargoes and holding up to a very difficult situation very well. And on both fronts, so it looks now much more relaxed. And many of the fears which were existing for next winter are receding a little bit in the background. It's like, you know now the train which is coming because you can see it long before and you can deal with it. The problem with the current situation arises if the situation goes wrong for Russia militarily, if Russia feels cornered, because it gives Russia the possibility to scale up and down global oil prices simply by scaling up and down what they still export in terms of crude oil and in terms of refined products. If Russia is cornered, and if the president decides that it's time to teach a harder lesson to the West, then he can limit exports and that will drive oil prices up. It's not a 0-1 situation. It's not cutting oil exports or not cutting them. They can do that on a sliding scale. That would increase the oil price, and at some point that would create damage for the very nascent economic recovery which we have now in the US and in Europe.
Some recovery, yes, indeed, but energy price crisis certainly has had a massive impact on Europe, including the United Kingdom. What's your outlook for the months to come, and how much does energy policy tie in with the broader fight against inflation?
I think the fight against inflation is not over, will not be over for a very long time, because of the unprecedented level of government debt we have all over Europe, including in the UK. And to some extent, of course, the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine directly have contributed to that debt. But to the larger extent, this is an unfolding story for many years before the Ukraine crisis. In that situation, if energy prices are high, they feed into inflation, and that is, of course, detrimental to an economic recovery. But I think we will see some relaxation at the energy front. It's also probably worthwhile to take a longer view and to reassure ourselves that someday that war will be over. I have no idea how this will look like Korea or like, God forbid, some landscape blighted with weapons of mass destruction. But people will stop referring it to a war because the shooting will have stopped sometime between now and the next 3 years. What will happen then is that we have a combination of oil and gas prices and coal prices coming down as the system readjusts after years of high prices, the cycle turns, and governments being much poorer than they used to be because of this rising debt level, which is kept up by, among other things, the costs of the war. That's a combination which will be new, which will have impacts on climate policy and on things like that, but it's not necessarily a very bad combination.
OK, well, Christof Ruehl, the Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University's Centre on Global Energy Policy, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.